Palworld has been completely and utterly wrecked. The biggest drop-off in player base ever in Steam history. Much like Icarus himself, it rose too high and then came crashing down to the ocean below, where it was swallowed by the waves, right? This is Palworld, right? This is exactly what I said was going to happen. I explained this to you right off the bat. You cannot sell a video game IP based on contempt for another property or a franchise. Let's be real here. This was the only reason that anybody talked about Palworld at all. It was because of the Pokemon thing. The only reason that I was invested in the Palworld thing was because of the Pokemon thing, because of the blatant plagiarism, because of the damage control for said plagiarism, because of the continued insistence that this was going to be a Pokemon competitor, like a viable alternative to Game Freak's Pokemon, right? This was supposed to be the next big thing, and it just did not happen, right? The drop-off was not unprecedented because I saw it coming, but like the fact that it was so sharp and so quick, like you can't even call this a flavor of the month release. That's how bad this was, right? When you look at like just the general pattern here, like this is becoming more and more common, isn't it? Where like random games keep coming out of nowhere that the community loves to pretend are like embarrassing Nintendo, right? We saw this with like Genshin Impact. Like you'll see YouTubers like Trash Taste. You'll see them come out and say like, "Oh, Genshin's huge." Like I'm always seeing people cosplaying at conventions, without like really failing without like while conveniently failing to mention the fact that like those are sponsored cosplayers, that Genshin's like appeal is entirely based on like, again, like much like Palworld, it was a plagiarized thing that the community liked to latch on to as an attempt to downplay Pokemon, right? You know, Genshin is really interesting. Like it's kind of the predecessor to Palworld in a lot of ways, right? Like we're seeing this with a lot of other knockoff properties. Like you're always seeing people rail on like Fire Emblem and like all this stuff. Like the reality is, I think, the industry has to copycat Nintendo in order to get any kind of interest from anyone at all, right? To me, like Palworld exploding the way it did, it doesn't indicate like a strong, healthy PC player base. Like it indicates an industry, an audience that's desperate to play Nintendo games, right? These are the guys who always pretend they're pirating Nintendo games on their high-end PCs while still, for some reason, begging them to get ported over, right? I've talked about this double standard before, but like with Palworld, it's really interesting because we saw this game get hyped up as the next big thing. We saw them pretend this was like what Pokemon should be. This was like an evolution of the formula. This is what they always wanted to play. But the reality is quite different, right? Game Freak has managed to retain popularity and relevancy for 20 years, 25 years, almost 30. Like they've been able to retain their relevancy for that long, and meanwhile Palworld couldn't stay relevant for more than 2 weeks, right? Like the comparison here is shocking, right? When you actually stop to look at it, when you actually stop and like really consider that like Pokemon has been able to like, you know, grow and evolve, introduce new characters, side game spin-offs, like constantly just upping the ante with each new release, always like changing things, like just being the best there is at what it does, right? And meanwhile, you'll have like these Palworld enablers like try to convince you, oh, Dragon Quest was a better monster catching game. Never mind that monsters came after Pokemon, right? Like, never mind that the monster mechanics in Dragon Quest V aren't anywhere near what like Pokemon does, right? They don't work the same way at all. Like, never mind that the monster designs look absolutely nothing alike, right? You'll see people come out and try to say that like, oh, Pokemon ripped off Dragon Quest, but like it's just a cope, bro. Like it really is just a cope to try and make Palworld look more original than it actually is, to make it look more desirable than it actually is, to pass it off as a legit, like, extremely well thought out, like, fleshed out, interesting new IP, when in reality, it hasn't even left early access. And honestly, the more I think about it, the more I look at, like, the history of Pocket Pair and, like, what they did with, like, Craftopia, which was, like, a Breath of the Wild clone. Like, this is, I think, their modus operandi. Like, just rip off a bunch of assets, put it in early access, and then, like, abandon the game once it sells enough units, right? That's kind of my thought process on this. Like, I don't think Palworld's ever going to leave early access. Like, that's kind of my thought on this at this point, because that'll open up the gates to people, like, refunding the game and stuff like that. Like, the reality is, like, Palworld is not a very good video game. And it's one of those situations where, the Pretendos, the Pokemon Pretendos, those guys, the Pokepals, I started calling them, like, they really don't want to admit, like, just how badly Pokemon has been able to stomp Palworld, right? It's starting to look more and more as if Palworld's going to be completely forgotten by the time Pokemon Day hits and we start getting new information about, like, the new upcoming Pokemon products for the year, right? Like, I don't think anybody will be talking about it at all come year's end, right? Like, people are even now acknowledging that, like, wow, the sales numbers don't look as impressive as they were initially sold to us as initially reported, right? Like, I do think people are noticing these things. I think they are acknowledging them. And I do think this is, like, going to be the beginning of the end in a lot of ways, because I do see a lot of people, like, noticing really, really interesting things about the gaming industry. Specifically that nobody cares how many people are playing a game on Steam, right? Palworld was allegedly the most played game on Steam ever, right? And what happened? It fell off a cliff in a matter of weeks. Baldur's Gate 3 was allegedly a really popular game on Steam. Nobody remembers that game. Elden Ring was hyped as an extremely popular game on Steam. Like, nobody remembers Elden Ring, right? Like, that is the situation we're in now, where the industry is, like, they can't report on sales anymore because Nintendo's outperforming them. They can't, like, try and prop up every new, like, niche IP that comes out anymore because Nintendo is outstripping them in every way, shape, and form, right? They can't, like, focus on realistic graphics anymore because people aren't impressed by realistic graphics. So what they have to do is do this weird thing where they have to pretend that all of their games are way more popular than they actually are, right? And this has been a reoccurring trend for a long, long, long time, right? Overwatch, like, Blizzard is, like, legit in the process of getting folded into Activision during the Microsoft takeover. And, like, they're still reporting that Overwatch has, like, 50 million players, Like, they're still, like, releasing statements like that when that's obviously not the case at all. Like, Overwatch 2 completely killed the brand, right? And they won't openly admit it, right? Sea of Thieves isn't doing well. Like, they'll claim that it has, like, 30 million players, but that's not true, right? Like, again, it's the issue is that the industry is trying to move towards this live service model, right? That's what they're trying to do. So what they need is for people to care more about active players more than sales, right? That's the goal. They know they can't compete with Nintendo in single player games or party games or online games. So they have to, like, do a genre, like a thing that Nintendo is not doing at all, like the live service model, the Fortnite model, right? Like, they're going to try and make this into, like, every single game ever. Like, they're going to all have the same success that Fortnite has had, and they're all going to buy Nintendo, and they're all going to, like, it's not going to happen, right? Like, it just simply is not going to happen. And I do think this is the major takeaway here is when it comes to the YouTube community in particular, the online Twitter discourse community, the gaming community as a whole, people legit wanted to believe that the Pokemon Company was going to fail because of this game, right? Like, they weren't pushing Palworld as, like, a viable competitor or something that would compete with Pokemon. No. They thought Palworld would make Pokemon obsolete. Like, they legit were saying this 2 weeks ago. And now they're saying, plummeting player counts? Oh, that doesn't matter. Oh, who cares about that? Like, I had my fun with the game. Oh, I did everything in it. Like, it's normal to move on to a new game after you're done. Hey, genius. You weren't saying the same thing about Zelda or Mario Wonder. Like, conveniently, when it's a Nintendo game, you're always complaining about the Link and how, like, nobody's talking about it anymore. But then suddenly, when Palworld drops off, far more suddenly, I might add, when Palworld drops off, suddenly it's not an issue. Like, I'm sensing kind of a double standard here, Like, I've been pointing this out for a long time. I've been addressing this, like, over and over and over again. I've made, like, endless videos and, like, discussed this topic at length, but, like, yeah, like, the bias against Nintendo really is unacceptable in this industry, right? Like, I've been talking about this for years, but, like, it really does feel like it's coming to a head, to the point where, like, the stuff that the Pretendos have to promote, that they have to push forward, that they have to enable, like, the narratives they have to push, like, they are straight up delusional. Right? There was no way that Palworld was going to retain its relevancy long term. There was no way they were going to be able to compete with Pokemon. Right? There was no way the Pokemon company was going to go out of business because of Palworld. Right? But you certainly didn't see the YouTubers admit that. You certainly didn't see 4chan admit that, or NeoGAF, or Reset Era, or X. Elon Musk's new social media platform. Right? You didn't see that anywhere except on this channel, right? Harmon Smith is the only person out there who told you like it was from the start, right? None of this like, Palworld's a good game. Like, no, I came out and told you that this thing was cheaply made, that it was plagiarized, that it wasn't going to last, like that people were only shilling it because of Pokemon. And, like, everyone tried to call me insane. Everybody made countless response videos. And yet, they couldn't find a good point, could they? They couldn't make a single good argument, aside from, like, pointing to the obviously fake sales numbers on Twitter, right? They couldn't do anything to dispute any of my very real points about Palworld, because I was completely right about everything, right? Right from the onset, before it even became popular, before people began to show it, like, I went on live stream and told you this game was nonsense, right? Like, I explained that to you very clearly, and what do you know? I was right.